Hey there, and welcome back to the ASP.NET Core training for beginners. So remember, this is a training course that we do every Monday, and this is already the 6th lesson, and we have covered some ground already, I would say. So I guess it's not bad. Just to make a short recap of what we have done so far. So first of all, we have discussed in the very first lesson some core concepts that we will be working with the entire course. And it was more a theoretical lesson without any coding in it, but we talked about things like what is actually MVC, what is a REST API, and how does HTTP work, what is actually, or what makes the HTTP protocol to be an HTTP protocol. So there are some things that we might really need to know about how we have to communicate, because our API, because we are building an API here, essentially has to know how to communicate with its clients or applications that make calls to that API. So we have looked into that, and then we have kind of like set up our basic API. Then we have talked about services, which are very important when it comes to ASP.NET Core. Literally, they are crucial. So you can't really have an ASP.NET Core application without this idea of services, which is very important, and especially the service lifetimes. And we have discussed what actually transient means, what scoped means, what singleton means. And we then discussed or talked about middleware, which was actually the previous lesson. So we looked into, well, very conceptually what a middleware is. And then we have seen different ways how we can implement the middleware in ASP.NET Core. So directly in the startup class, but then also we have looked into how we can actually code our own middleware class and have our own middleware extension method that we can actually use when we want to register our middleware. And that's kind of like what we did so far. And we have here also a very basic controller. Like we have implemented already very basic CRUD operations on that one. And well, here we just return okay, so we don't do any stuff, but the controller is there. So if we run the application, let's actually do that. I mean, running the application. Let's bring it to the other screen. We see that we have this Swagger documentation that will open up. And here we already will be able to see our endpoints. So you see we have a get, we have a post, we have a get by ID, we have then a put for updating and a delete for deleting. So we have a full CRUD controller for our resource hotels, which is very nice, I would say. Okay, and the next logical step that we will do is we want to start with real resources, so to work with the real thing. And for that we will have to implement or use a database. Now what we'll do here is we will use a SQL database, of course, but we'll use a SQL Server database that's actually built into Visual Studio. So it's easier when we are at the beginning stage to actually get started with that database without taking care about other concepts. And what I would also like to express here is we won't go into SQL concepts, because nowadays when we build our applications, we have some tools that are usually called ORMs, or Object Relational Mappers, that actually are able to query the database, retrieve records, and then transform them to actually our own domain classes. Like for instance, we would probably have a table hotels, and in the table we will have a bunch of stuff, of course. Now what we can do with such an ORM is that we can retrieve those, or the ORM will look into the hotels table, will read the data from SQL, which is formatted in a totally different way. So it's actually totally different, or not totally, but different than what we have here in our code, like classes. But then the tools, this ORM is able to translate that data that it actually reads from the database to our hotel class. So it will actually populate all the properties that we have with values that actually come from the database. So the good side of this thing is that we as developers, at least right now at our beginning stage, is that we don't really have to care a lot about SQL concepts, we will discuss a little bit of basic relationships, of course, because they are needed, for instance, to model this idea of a hotel that has a list of rooms, of course. So we will just a little bit go into this detail, but commonly what we will do is, well, we'll just use this ORM, which, by the way, is called Entity Framework Core. There are a bunch of different other ORMs, but this one, from my point of view, is, well, the easiest to get started with. So we'll use that, and that will do all the magic and retrieve our data from the database and write the data to the database when we need to write that data. So that's also a very, very important part. So yeah, we won't look into, so this won't be a deep dive into SQL. We will just actually concentrate on our code and see exactly how we can get our code, our basic API, then working with a database that we will set up. So that's kind of like what we will do today, and we'll walk through this process. We'll have to do different things in all the layers of the applications probably. So yeah, let's just get started with it. So if we look at our project structure right now, we see that we have here this this project, which is the API itself. So this is the ASP.NET Core API. But then we have this CWK booking.data access layer, and this should be the layer where we will actually need to put our data. And then we have, of course, this domain layer where we have our model classes, and then we have our services layer where we will put our services, and probably we'll talk about services in the next lesson, so next Monday. Today we will just get used to use the database, and probably the next lesson we'll actually look into other concepts like repositories and services, and how do we actually use them. Okay, so this means that if we want to work with the database, we will need to install some packages in the package or in the project that will contain our classes that are related to the database, and we'll see what type of classes it will actually contain. So let me just right click here on dependencies in this data access layer project and go here to NuGet package manager. And we will have to install a bunch of stuff here. Let's choose NuGet as our source for the packages that we want to install and browse. So let me search first. So as said, the ORM that will help us and that we will use to actually work with the database is Entity Framework Core. So if we search for Microsoft Entity Framework Core, we'll actually find this package. However, and this is a very, very important thing. When you install a NuGet package, and especially, or most often when you install a NuGet package, when you have to install it, you also have to decide about the version that you have to install. Now, we see here that we have this latest stable version, which is 6.0, and probably we will be, well, say, oh, this is the latest version, let's just jump in and install that. However, things don't work like that, so we have to be a little bit careful, because when it comes to Entity Framework Core and ASP.NET Core, they kind of need to use the exact same versions of the different products and services that they actually use. So those two need to be in sync. Now, the thing is that in our API, we are not using ASP.NET Core 6, which is the latest one that came out around 1 month ago, but we are using .NET 5, which is the previous version of .NET. So this means that when we install right now Entity Framework Core, we have to actually pick here a version that starts with 5. And of course, from 5, we will take then the latest version from 5. And that should be it. So we can then install that. Have to click on I accept, and everything should be okay right now. But then there is another package that we need to install. It's still part or coming together or working together with Entity Framework Core, but it's a sub-product. And we'll use here this Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQL Server project. Now, let me just briefly explain you why we have here, or why do we need to install SQL Server, even if we already have installed Microsoft Entity Framework Core. Now, Entity Framework Core is a very, very powerful ORM. And as it is a very powerful ORM, it actually has to cater for a lot of different scenarios that different type of applications might face. And one very common scenario is that not all the applications are using the exact same database type. Now, for instance, we will be using Microsoft SQL Server as a relational database, but other applications might use an Oracle database, and other applications might use a Postgres, a SQL database, or other applications might even go for a non-relational database, which would be something like MongoDB. And this means that actually this ORM, so this whole concept of ORM, it actually needs to work a little bit differently when it comes to working with the data sources itself. Because there is one way that you work with SQL Server, there is a different way that you work with Oracle, there is a different way that you will work with a non-relational database. So that's why the guys from Entity Framework Core also created then different packages that kind of are like implementations for different type of databases that we might use in our applications. Just 1 second. Okay, so that's why we also need to install this SQL Server, because we want to work with SQL Server. And in fact, let me just check if instead of SQL, let's try to, okay, but I wanted Oracle. You see that here we have Microsoft Entity Framework Core extension EF Core, but this comes not from, this doesn't really come from, let me see, do they have a provider for PostgreSQL? I guess they should have. PostgreSQL convention, so that would be something for PostgreSQL. So I guess you get the idea. So we need to also install the package that corresponds to the database that we want to use in our application. And in our case, it is a Microsoft SQL Server. Once again, we have to be careful when we choose what version we want to install, because once again, our ASP.NET Core API is .NET 5, so we need to install the 5.0.12 version of SQL Server. Okay, so that would install that. I would expect just in a few seconds, maybe. I would have expected it to be faster, but there should be also a pop-up here that that we have to accept things. Okay, so let's just accept that. And then what we'll also need is, let me just check the installed. So we have Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQL Server. Okay, but I'm not sure exactly why we didn't install the Microsoft Entity Framework Core. So I guess I was talking here a lot and the installation didn't actually go through. So let me, but it is installed. It should be installed. I'm not sure why they don't. Okay, so it was simply just not refreshing. Cool. So and then there's a third package that we actually need to install, and I will explain you exactly what this package does maybe a little bit later. But right now we just need to know that we need to also install this Microsoft Entity Framework Core Tools package. And here once again we have to be very careful with the version, because we need once again this 5.0.12 version, as we are using ASP.NET Core 5, not 6. So that's why we have to pay attention. If you have your ASP.NET Core application on .NET 6, then you can install also Microsoft Entity Framework Core 6. If you have your .NET Core application on, I don't know, maybe ASP.NET Core version 3.1, then you would have to make sure to look for the package for Entity Framework Core that has the version 3.1, and it doesn't really matter what the third number is. But just for that, you actually would have to be careful for that. And so that's it. We have installed all our packages here in our data access layer. So if we expand here these packages, we see that we have here these 3 packages that we have installed. So with this one, we should be good to go. However, we will also need to inject or to use or to register our database services, and we'll see exactly how we will do that in our ASP.NET Core application, just like we do with services. And we have talked about services a lot, I guess, in the third lesson here in this training. So this means that we would also have to install some Entity Framework Core related packages into our API project. So let's also right click dependencies on the API project, and let's click here on browse. First, I just need to also change the source here. And once again, we have to install Microsoft Entity Framework Core, but here once again we need version 5, so let's install that. We install essentially the exact same packages that we have installed in the data access layer. We install them even here, and we will see exactly why, or we will get exactly why we need them here, probably when we will do the service registration. So let's install Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQL Server, which is exactly the same package that we have also installed in our data access layer. And by the way, guys and girls, if you have any questions or if you just want to add something, please just feel free to jump in the chat and write. It would be very, very important for me that if you have some unclarities, some uncertainties, that those would be answered. So that's, from my point of view, the main difference between a training that we're doing through live sessions than just uploading some video tutorials, because here you can get involved, you can have your questions answered as soon as possible, actually in real time, I would say. But there is also another package, sorry for that. So coming back, don't forget, whenever you have a question, please just ask. And I really mean it when I say that there are no dumb questions, there are only questions that needs to be answered. So we have here then Microsoft, and we need this Entity Framework Core tools. So let's install that. But once again, we have to be careful to pick this 5.0.12 version. And I guess that we should then be good to go. So as a short summary to that part, the first thing that we need to do when we want to work with the database is to actually install these packages for Entity Framework. And once again, we install these packages because we use Entity Framework as an object relational mapper, or ORM, that will help us really a lot with the database. We won't need to write any SQL code. We just need to write our own code, and this Entity Framework will know how to interact with the underlying SQL database. Okay, so we have installed everything. Now, the next step is, of course, well, we have to create a database. And as this is a course for beginners, I really want to keep this as easy and simple as possible. And as we are using Visual Studio, and of course this is also valid if I'm using Visual Studio 2022, but the same is valid for Visual Studio 2019, for instance, or even 2017, but I doubt that you are using Visual Studio 2017. The idea is that when we install Visual Studio, you also have a SQL Server Express database. And the cool thing about that is that if we go here on the view, we have this SQL Server Object Explorer. And this opens kind of like this tab for us. Now, there will be different entries here, but I will open here this one, which is local DB project models, which is added actually by Visual Studio 2022, but you could even use, for instance, probably if you use Visual Studio 2019, you have this local DB MS SQL local. You can just expand that one. Now I will use this one here, and when we expand that, we see that we have here these databases, security, and server objects. Of course, what we care about here is the databases folder. And here in this databases folder, we see that we already have some databases, and these are actually databases for other applications that I am doing live streams on. If you haven't created any database, then probably your folder here would be empty, but it will be not empty for long, because if you right click on that, you have here this add new database. And as our application is called CWK booking, I will call also my database CWK booking. So let's just create it, click on OK, and that should be done. You see that right now in this list, we have this CWK booking database. Of course, right now the database itself is fairly empty. It's actually, when we go on tables, it doesn't actually contain anything, just system tables. But these tables are things that we actually don't care about. These are there for SQL Server. It needs them, so we don't need to touch them at all. What we will achieve today is that at the end of the lesson, we will have here in this database our own tables. Okay, so step one, we have installed the necessary NuGet packages in our data access layer and in our API layer. Step two, we have used the SQL Server Object Explorer to create a new SQL Server database right here. Now, the next thing that we need to do is we need to tell our application, or we need to tell Entity Framework Core how it actually needs to connect to the database. Because usually the database is somewhere on a remote server, or however, the application itself and Entity Framework does need to know exactly where the database is located, which credentials it should use to connect to the database. And to do that, we use always one thing that is called a connection string. So remember, each application to connect to a database, it actually needs a connection string. The connection string is nothing else than an instruction to the ORM, in our case Entity Framework Core, about how it should reach the server where the database resides and how the database is called. And that's essentially everything that that our application needs for that. And to do that, we need actually to generate a connection string. Now, this might seem to be a little bit tricky, and probably with experience you will learn to write your own connection strings, but I want to walk you through how you can get the connection string here from the database that you have here in SQL Server Object Explorer. So there is one first thing that you have to do, and let me bring a notepad over because we'll need it. The first thing that you'll need to do is to right click on this tree actually, or this root of the tree where you have created your database. Now, as said, I have created a database in this local DB project models, but just right click the one where you have created your database. And then you have these properties. So just click on properties, and this other window will open here just below, but let me just move a little bit the camera for now, so that you also would be able to see that. And here somewhere, I'm not exactly sure where, but we should have something like a connection string. So we have here the default database, operating system, processor. That's not actually something that we would need. Connections. So we just have database settings. Okay, security. Okay, I don't see the connection string. Oh, it's the first one. So yeah, sorry for that. It's really the first one. So in general, it's the first one. You see the connection string. So you can just cut this, or Control C to copy that. And let's paste this in this notepad that we have here. And we see that it kind of like contains different things. First of all, it contains this data source, and it says exactly, okay, what is the data source? What is the server? Or where exactly is the server where the database resides? And in fact, we can now close these properties because we don't need that anymore. Let me also move the camera back. And yeah, let me open the notepad once again. And then after you tell actually in this connection string where the database resides on what server exactly, and by the way, here you could specify even a remote location of a server, as long as firewall rules allow you to actually arrive or make calls to the server. That would be possible to do from your application. But in this case, it just points to these local DB project models. And then there is the second thing that we have here, which is the initial catalog. And initial catalog is nothing else than the name of the database that we actually want to use. And here we have this master. Master is actually the master database of each server, but we don't want to use the master. We want to use our own database instead. So we will just have to replace the master with CWK booking. And right now in this connection string, we provide exactly what we would need, or what database we actually want to work with. So, and that would be, then we have different type of settings for security reasons, and we'll just keep them. And just like that, we have a connection string. So right now, as we generated this connection string, we need a way to actually instruct Entity Framework Core exactly what connection string it should actually use. And that's very easy to achieve. For now, I will close down the SQL Server Object Explorer view, but we'll open it later to really check that our database is working. Once again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Don't be shy. It's very, very important that if you have any type of doubts or concerns, or if you just want to say something, please don't be shy and use the chat. That's why the chat is here. Okay, so let me then go back to the API. Now, in this API, and in actually every ASP.NET Core project, and virtually no matter what the platform that you are building a web application on, you will have a file that will contain application settings. Now, in ASP.NET Core, by default, I say by default because we couldn't even create our own files, we have this file called appsettings.json. And when we click on it, we see that what it contains is some basic application settings in JSON format. Now, these settings regard logging, and we won't actually dive into logging right now. If we want, we have a dedicated playlist about ASP.NET Core logging. So if you're interested in this topic, then just go to that playlist and watch the videos there after this one, of course. So right now, please stay with me. And then what hosts are actually allowed to make calls to our web application. In this case, this star means that we actually allow all hosts to make calls to our applications. So what we will need to do is we'll need to add a new setting here for the connection string. And right now, so we have to use this comma because we just want to add a new object and, well, use quotation marks. And we see that Visual Studio kind of like already says, do you maybe want to use a property that is called connection strings? And we say, yes, we just want to do that. Because you see, it's very important. It makes your life very easy if you name this property connection strings. Theoretically, you could name it whatever way you would like. But you'll see just in a few minutes that it actually makes your life much easier if you name this property here, this JSON property, connection strings. Okay, and then here, this will actually take, or this is a configuration object, so you can provide several different properties here. But let's call this property default. So we want to have a connection string that we will consider our default connection string for our application. So in this quotation mark, so inside of them, we will just have to then copy the connection string that we have created here, and we will just paste it here. And just like that, we have configured our connection string here in our application. And Uday, how Dapper is different from EF Core? That's actually a good question, and probably that's something that we will discuss more in depth on the other live stream for some more advanced scenarios. But Dapper is really totally different than Entity Framework Core. The main difference is that Entity Framework Core has a lot of functionalities that revolve around the concept of change tracking or automatical change tracking. It also actually has these very rich extensions to link queue, so that we can easily build different type of queries using link queues. Now in Dapper, things are actually not that easy, in the sense that usually in Dapper you would execute a stored procedure and get a result from that. So you would have to write the stored procedure, or you would have to execute directly a SQL query. But no matter the way or what you actually choose in Dapper, the idea is that you still have to write SQL in the end. Because no matter if you just want to write a SQL query, read it from a file and execute it on the SQL server, or that if you create a stored procedure directly on the SQL server, you still need to write SQL. Now, Entity Framework Core comes with this great thing, and I mean, especially for, I would say, small projects and developers that are kind of like at the beginning stages of their career, it's actually very, very easy to get started with Entity Framework Core because you actually don't have to write any SQL at all. Entity Framework Core handles everything for you. So if you use Dapper, of course, it would imply that you would have to be fairly familiar also with writing SQL scripts. And of course, due to the fact that that Dapper actually executes directly scripts on the server, it doesn't have change tracking. It's also much faster. That's true. So there are scenarios where you might want to use Dapper. For instance, in real production applications, I usually go the way that I use Dapper for queries and I use Entity Framework Core for write operations. Because of that change tracking that we have in EF Core, it could prove very, very useful. So yeah, that's kind of like the major difference between Dapper and Entity Framework Core. And for here, in this lesson, we'll just use Entity Framework Core. I hope my answer was clear enough. If you still have a question regarding that, then please just let me know. Okay, so we have this connection string, so with this one we should be good to go. Now let's do another step. And for that one, we come back to this startup.cs class. Remember, this startup.cs class, it has virtually two different parts. This configure services method, where we configure our ASP.NET Core services, and the configure method, where we configure our middleware pipeline. And about middleware pipeline, we have talked in depth during the last lesson, last Monday, and we even added this custom middleware that we have created that actually adds a header to the application with a date time. I'm glad the explanation was useful for you. Thank you very much for asking. And if you have any other questions, all the other viewers, please once again follow Udai's example. Don't be shy and just get involved in the chat. I would be really happy to get a discussion going here. Even if this is theoretically a lesson, it's important that we have this option here. I'm doing this live streaming because you have the option to actually get in touch and get answer in real time mostly. So yeah, cool. Now, as said, when we want to add the database to our application, we have added the connection string, but now we kind of like need to instruct our API, hey, you need to use Entity Framework Core when it comes to the database. So what we need to do is that we need a way to add Entity Framework Core to our dependency injection container. And once again, we have talked in depth about services and the dependency injection container in the third lesson, I guess, here. So this means that we would need to perform something here. And the way that we add Entity Framework Core is actually very easy. It's services add DB context. Okay, and this DB context, just a second, my Visual Studio plays crazy. This DB context is actually a generic method. Now we won't get deep into this idea of using a generic method, but when we want to use this add DB context, there is actually two things that we need to provide. We need to provide a generic type parameter, which should be the DB context, and we'll talk about the DB context just in 1 second. And we'll have to provide some options for the DB context. And one of the options that we would need to provide is what connection string it should use. So we have to instruct it that it needs to use the connection string that we have just added to Appsettings.json. So in order to get this connection string, let's have a variable here. Of course, we can do this directly in the method, but I really want to have this very procedural so that we have a clear look about what we actually are doing here. So we would have then here CS from connection string, and we have this configuration, and the app settings or the things that we write in the appsettings.json file, when the application starts up, is actually loaded into this configuration property. So one thing that we can do is we can say here configuration, and here we have this method get connection string. And the cool thing about this is, and I'll just show you in a while, we just have to specify the name of the property where our connection string is, and the name of the property was default. And this kind of like loads and gets the connection string that we have in our app settings file. However, there is very one important thing when you are using this get connection string. And once again, that's not the only way to do that. You can use, or you can get different sections from the appsettings.json file, let's say manually, but ASP.NET Core has these extension methods that kind of like is very helpful for us because it already knows exactly how to get the connection string. However, the prerequisite for that, of course, is that in our appsettings.json file, so this one here, we need to have a property that is named connection strings. And inside that property, we should, well, specify which exact connection string we want to load. Because we could have, for instance, here different connection strings. One for the development environment, one for the production environment, one for the testing environment, and so on and so forth. And based on that, we could add here or read here, based on the environment, a different connection. So in this case, we say that we want from the connection strings, get me the default connection string. And this would actually get this connection string from appsettings.json file. So now in order to add the DB context, we need to go one step further, and we need to talk about what actually that DB context is. And for that, we will just go back to our data access layer, and here we'll right click on it and we'll create a new class. And we will call this class data context. Okay, and we need to make this public because we'll need to use this data context actually in all our ASP.NET Core applications, so not only in this specific layer. And one important thing is to make a class to be a DB context. Well, we need to inherit, of course, from DB context. And this DB context base class is actually in this Microsoft Entity Framework Core package that we have installed right at the beginning. We have another question. Can we comment allowed host once we have at least one connection string? I'm not sure exactly what you mean, but the allowed hosts is actually a different setting. So we can keep that actually. The idea is what this setting does, allowed hosts, it specifies a list of hosts that are actually able to call your web application. Now, as we have star here, it means that we can actually, that we allow everybody to make calls to our web application. But we could, for instance, specify here things like, I don't know, Microsoft.com. And in that case, our application or only requests that would come from this host would be then accepted by the application. So this is kind of like a way to limit exactly who is able to interact with your application. It's especially useful, for instance, if you're building an application that is kind of like used inside a company, and you just want to have calls that actually come from that specific company and nothing else. So this is one way to achieve that. So this setting regarding allowed hosts is totally different. So I would just keep it because during startup in the program.cs file, actually the startup process or the building process of the application, it actually reads this information from here. So yeah, I would rather leave that here. I wouldn't just delete it or comment it out. Okay, so let's go back right now to this whole data context. And of course, this whole idea of DB context is, well, it could be explained very complicated, and it is very complex because it has a fair amount of complexity to it. But it's also very, very simple to get started with, because we can imagine as this concept of DB context, that's actually your database or the image of the database, but in your code. So the DB context is actually nothing else like a photo of the database. And I hope this analogy is clear enough. So when we, I don't know, when we see, I don't know, maybe a mountain, so we take a photo of it. And that photo is the exact photo of the mountain. So it kind of like represents the mountain, but on a total different media, in this case on a screen. Now, the DB context is exactly the same thing. We have a database that will eventually contain different tables. So the data context is nothing else than a snapshot of our database, but a snapshot that is actually written in C# code. And that's actually what this DB context is, nothing more than that. So it's actually the code representation of the database itself. And to do that, we will need a constructor here. So let's use a constructor for that. And the thing is here, at least, this is how we do it in ASP.NET Core. In other type of applications that don't have a default dependency injection container, you might need to do this differently, but we mostly write applications nowadays that have this dependency injection container, because even if we want to build a WPF application, we have .NET Core that supports WPF as well. And the thing is that we have this type of class, which is DB context options, we can actually provide as an incoming parameter to the constructor. And what we can do is simply pass that options object to the base class, so to the DB context class. And that's essentially what we do here, nothing else. And we'll see just in a second. I guess everything will make sense. But before we get really started and wire things up, what's the problem here? Okay, we have this error on the DB context. We'll solve that really quick. So we don't need to do anything else in the constructor right now. Now, one very important thing about the DB context is that, as I said, it actually is a representation of your database that you have in C# code. So it's once again like a snapshot, like a photo of your database in your application itself. Now, in order to do that, of course, we would need to define some properties that would kind of like instruct and tell, okay, what tables do we have? And here we have to also look at our domain model. So if we look here on the right side, we have this hotel, which will presumably have its own table in the database. We have this reservation, which will also presumably have its own table in the database. And we also have this room, which once again, presumably it will have its own table in the database. So this means that what we need to do here is we have to specify in this DB context what our tables should actually be. And in this case, we do this via some properties that are of type DB set. Once again, this DB set is a generic a class, and we say that we need a DB set of a hotel. Of course, we will need to add a reference to our domain project, and right now it should be good to go. So by doing that, what we do, of course, we also need to give a name to this one, so it would be hotels. So what we did here is nothing else to tell this data context, this DB context, that we will have a table that is called hotels, and that it will contain a hotel. And this is the way that actually Entity Framework Core is able to read the database or read into that table and know exactly what column to put in which property of your hotel class. So that's why we actually need to specify this here. Okay, cool. So now we also need, once again, a public DB set of a room, and we'll call this rooms. This would represent a table for rooms. And then we will also need a public DB set of reservation, and we'll call this reservations. Okay, and that's pretty much all that we need right now for this DB context. Okay, I have doubt on dependency injection. Can we have an example how it works in ASP.NET Core in a very layman words? We talked 1.5 hours about dependency injection, also drawing very graphical things. how dependency injection works, what it is, what the dependency injection container is. And I would strongly then advise you to go, I guess, in this playlist. So in this series, it was the lesson 3. So go to lesson 3. The entire video there is only about dependency injection. So it's very hard to really do a summary of 1 hour and a half just here in a few seconds. So please go there, and I'm really sure that you will totally understand exactly what dependency injection is and how it works, because we have also drawn that on the whiteboard and discussed about that. So I'm really sure that it would be very, very helpful for you. Okay, let me just have also a drink. Cool. Now, okay. So now we have this. Right now we can go back to our startup class and finish up what we wanted to do here. Once again, what we want to do here is actually register our DB context, this snapshot of the database, in our ASP.NET Core application, because we will need it here. So we want to have it in the dependency injection container. So the way we do this is we have this add DB context method, which is part of Microsoft Entity Framework Core. And as I said, this is a generic method, so we have to specify a generic type param. And what we need to specify here is what our DB context is, or what class is actually our DB context. And our DB context is the data context class that we have just created. Add the reference to this one, that's okay. That's exactly what we need. And remember, once again, this class is a DB context because it inherits the DB context class from Microsoft Entity Framework Core. We can even just delete these unnecessary usings, and we should actually be good to go right now. So back to the startup. So we have provided here this information that we want to add the DB context, and that this class is our DB context. So the class that contains an overview of all the tables that we have and things that are helpful to actually work with the database. But then the next thing is we'll have to provide some options here. And the option that we need to provide is we need to tell actually the DB context what connection string it should use. This essentially tells it to which database it should connect. So this takes in an options object. And here we can provide a lambda expression. And here we can see on this options object, we have this use SQL Server. But this should also be part of, I guess, Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQL Server. And that's why we needed to also install that package. And to this one, we just need to provide a string which represents the connection string, so that it should know to which database and how it should actually connect there. And the connection string, we have read it from our configuration using this get connection string method on the configuration property. So we can just provide the variable in there and everything should be good to go. Now here we still have a small error here. I'm not sure exactly why. The problem is it expects, of course, it should be like that. We need a semicolon after that. So that's it. That's how we actually have created actually this binding, I would say, between the database that we want to use and our ASP.NET Core application via this data context class, which is a DB context. This is a term that is very specific for Entity Framework Core, the ORM that we use. So with this one, we are actually mostly done from with wiring things up. So we should be good to go from this point of view. Now, the next thing is, well, we need a way right now to actually create the tables that we need based on the information that we have here in our data context. So in order to do that, we need to perform some actions. And there are actually two actions that needs to be performed. And one is adding a migration, and the other one is updating the database. And we'll do those one by one. So first of all, where we actually do this action, that needs to be done via some comments that are actually executed either directly with the .NET CLI, which I would recommend for developers that are already very familiar with .NET. But if we are all here at the getting started level, we'll just use a built-in tools that we have in Visual Studio. And to do that, and that's very important, we need to go to Tools. And in these tools, we have this NuGet Package Manager. And in this NuGet Package Manager, we have this Package Manager console. So let's just click on that, and that will open the console for the NuGet Package Manager just here below our code in Visual Studio. And that's quite fine. Now, there is one other thing that we need to do. And once again, that's very important. And if you look at different tutorials and trainings, and I really hate this about this way of proceeding, is that most of them put everything, like the database, the domain model, put everything in one single project. And of course, yeah, I understand that this should be a tutorial or a lesson for beginners. But in a real world, whenever you will create an application, even if you are a beginner, you would probably use application layers. And that's why I have designed this application to have different layers. And once again, each project in our Visual Studio solution is actually a layer. Now, this means that we have a layer for our API, which is the ASP.NET Core application, but we also have a layer for our data access. And it means that all stuff that is related to data access, it should go in that layer. So in that case, in our cwkbooking.dal project. Now, in order to do that, when you add a migration in Entity Framework Core, it will add some things, and we will look exactly what it will add. But we will have to instruct it where we want to add those type of things. And the way that we can do this in this Package Manager console is by going here at this default project and choosing the data access layer project. So we won't let this default CWK booking API, because that would put all the things that will be generated in our API layer, and we don't want that. That's why we have the data access layer. Everything that is related to data should be here. So that's why this is a very important step. You should come here and then choose your data access layer project. Sorry. And this means that whatever we will run right now in this console, and whatever it will generate in our data access layer project. Now, as said, the first thing that we need to do whenever we work with Entity Framework Core is whenever we do a change to our domain model, we need to add a migration. I'm not sure exactly why this naming in Entity Framework Core, but that's how they name things. We have to perform, let's say, an instruction and tell Entity Framework, hey, this is actually what I want you to add me in the database. And when I'm saying about add me to the database, we only think about structural things about the database. So if there needs to be a new table, if there needs to be a new column on a certain table, or if we want to change the data type of a table. So only changes that are structural, not like inserting. Inserting will be done via code, but structural decisions, well, we can't really do them via code, although of course, when we get into some more complicated stuff, we theoretically can do that as well. But normally we would just do that using this type of idea of migration. And how to do this in the Package Manager console, there is this command add migration, and then you just have to specify a name for the migration. And the name, for instance, I don't know, for this one, it would be the initial migration. Cool. So we just want to do that. So it will build the application. It should start building it, and it should create something. If it doesn't throw an error, that's also possible that it would throw some errors. We'll actually see that because we'll solve them. But no, we don't have any error. But what we have seen is that it kind of like opens something here for us. And if we look at it, let's make this a little bit smaller. They have added, or Entity Framework has added, this partial class, which has the name that we provided in the console when we ran this migration, and it inherits migration. So this concept of migration in Entity Framework Core. Once again, this is all code that was generated by Entity Framework Core, so it was not generated by us. And if we take a look here at the right, it also created a migrations folder. And if we take a look at that, we see that we have a migration here. Now, what this actually contains, it actually contains a definition of what changes will be applied to the database when we actually want to update or to execute this migration on the database itself. And here, this type of information that we might see here might seem a little bit complicated, but it's really not that complicated, and I guess you'll get accustomed with that. It actually here in this case, well, it's create table. It clearly creates a table, so there's nothing more to it. And further, you see the name of the tables, which will be hotels. And then you will see the columns of the tables, and it will contain a hotel ID. It will contain name, stars, address, city, country, and description. So it's pretty straightforward. Now, of course, there is then also this section where it says constraints. And as said, we won't dive deeper into SQL concepts, but constraints are like of the way or how we enforce different type of information and things happening on the database. Like, how do we create a relationship between two different tables? For that, we usually use things that are called a primary key and a foreign key. If we want to have unique values, for instance, in a certain column, then that would be another constraint. So this is what actually constraints means. Now, we don't have constraints except of the relationships that are built and that are using, well, this primary key and foreign key. And by the way, each table needs to have a primary key. So each record actually should have a value for a primary key. Then once again, it creates another table, which is rooms. It contains a room ID, a room number, surface, needs repair property, and a hotel ID. And this is the way that actually the relationship is made between the room and the hotel. Because if we go to the class hotel, we see that it actually has a list of rooms. So this means that we have a relationship. And this is actually a one-to-many relationship because we have one hotel, okay, that can have a list of rooms. And those rooms, they belong only to that hotel, not to any other hotel. So this is a one-to-many relationship. And the way this one-to-many relationship is done is that, well, we have to provide the ID towards the hotel that the room belongs to. And for that, we have this foreign key constraint. So we have a foreign key for that. Okay, so in this case, we see that this relationship was created. And then we have these reservations. And the reservation, it has a room ID, a start date, an end date, and the customer. And this is once again here a relation, because one reservation would also have a certain room. So it's a reservation for a certain room. But more than that, it could be, I could make a reservation, but yeah, right now it's a one-to-one relationship, because one reservation can have only one room. So I can make a reservation only for the room itself. But maybe later we'll add also here to be a list of rooms. So yeah, but we see that also this reservation gets created. And once again, as we have here, once again, this idea of relationship, we have this foreign key constraint, which is actually okay. And then we have indexes, and that's pretty much it. So if you read into this migration that was created for you by Entity Framework Core, it's actually a snapshot of what will happen on the database once you will actually execute this migration and update the database with it. And I see we have another question here. I have a database and I have scaffold models from it using scaffold syntax with Pomelo EF Core. Okay, I never used Pomelo, by the way. And after 1 month, I need to add 2 columns or table in a database. Then I have to scaffold again. When you scaffold, it actually means that you actually need to add from another source, because it's not something that you would actually generate. But if you add manually some properties to your existing models that are already modeled in the database, then you would of course have to run a migration. So guys, that's actually a very, very important thing with these migrations. It means that each time that we do any change, no matter how minor, on any of the domain models that we have defined here as being a DB set, then we have to create a new migration, because that change should be reflected also on the database. That's very, very important. And if you remember something from this lesson, it's this. Whenever you change anything to your domain model, no matter how minor the change is, you need to run a migration, because that change needs to be reflected in the database, of course. So for instance, if we would go here and, I don't know, maybe add another property to the room, that's a change to the model, and the database should know that we have a new property here. So we will need to go over and add a new migration for that. And during this course, we'll perform plenty of migrations, because we will be very often in a scenario where we want to update something to our existing domain model. And that's not something that we have to be worried about. That's something normal. That's how software evolves. It's really normal. The only thing is to always remember, right after you have performed any change, no matter how minor, on one class that is actually also defined as a DB set, you need to add the migration. Okay, so we have already added the migration, and we have looked into the migration. We have kind of like tried to explain what we can see here in this migration, and how this kind of like helps us to already visualize how the tables will actually look like once we actually push this migration to the database. And the way we do this is, once again, in this NuGet Package Manager console, we make sure once again that in this default project, this DAL project is selected, and the command for that is update-database. And that will also rebuild my application, and it will actually done. So right now, my database should be updated. Let's check it out. So we go once again on View, SQL Server Object Explorer. We know that this CWK booking was the database that I have provided a connection string for. And I don't know, let's do a refresh here. And if we go on tables, we see that indeed we have a table called hotels, we have a table called reservations, and we have a table called rooms. So exactly like we were able to see in the migration class that Entity Framework Core created for us. So nothing really special about that. However, if we take a look here, you might be wondering maybe, what's this DBO EF migration history thing here? Well, that's actually how Entity Framework Core keeps track about what migration has been already updated to the database and which not. So if we add a new migration at a certain point, what Entity Framework Core does, it actually goes to this table, and if we right click it, we can even see this view data. So whenever we run a migration, what Entity Framework Core does, it kind of like looks in this table and checks, was this migration already been performed? And it checks this using this migration ID that it actually generates, which is the same that we have also here, for instance. And if the migration has already been updated, or if the migration is part of this table, then it won't be updated again. So it won't be ran again on the database, because it has already been updated. But if it sees that, okay, we have one migration or two migrations that are not in this table, then it actually updates the tables or adds tables. So it performs the things that are actually specified in those migrations. And then it also adds those migrations to this table, so that the next time that we actually run this update database, it checks and says, now I have already 2 or 3 different migrations, so I don't have to take care about them anymore. And that's kind of like the mechanism that EF Core uses to keep track about what exactly has been already done on the database and what not. And that's actually very, very important. Usually we don't really have to tweak with this table. However, when you get into some more advanced scenarios and you might want to actually play around with everything, you can just, for instance, simply delete everything that's in here in this table, and then update the database, and that would theoretically run your migrations once again from scratch. However, you should in those cases probably also make sure that you already also delete the tables that you have, because those might be recreated when you create everything from scratch, and that wouldn't be possible because that they would have the same name, so you would get some errors on that. But that's just a side note. Theoretically, we can actually force to redo or rerun all migrations by tweaking with this table. But for now, it's actually just important for you to know that the way that we actually can or what we have in this database is that we have our tables, and besides our tables there is this EF migration history table that gets populated by Entity Framework Core, and usually we don't need to touch it unless we know exactly what we do. So now let's close everything up. Cool. So we have right now a working database. We have the tables that we need in the database. Now the next step is, of course, let's use this database in our controller so that we are able to actually work with the database itself and create resources and get resources. And well, of course, we have added our DB context to the service container. So what we can do here is we can inject it private read-only. Our DB context is called data context, and let's call this CTX. So we have this data context, okay. And we of course need it also here. And of course we also need to assign it. Cool, so we have that. Now, there is one thing that we have to think about right now, is that right now our controller methods, that they just return an iAction result because they are synchronous. But what we'll do right now, we'll use a database, and whenever we do something on a network, on files, on disk, whenever we do anything that is actually slower than the processor that we have on that current machine, it means that we actually need to think about async stuff. So we need to make everything async right now because we use a real database. That's not really too complicated. It's just, instead of returning an iAction result, we'll be returning a task of iAction result. And of course, we'll just mark it with the async keyword. And of course, we'll need to add the system threading tasks to that. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Now we have this headers that we actually read, and this header is actually added by our custom middleware that we have created during the last lesson, but we won't use it here anymore, because what we want here is to really read all the hotels from the database. So let's do just that. So we have this var, let's call this hotels, and here we have this var hotels equals, and then we will need the await keyword, of course, and we'll need the context, the DB context. And you see that on the DB context, we have those properties that we have added as DB set, like rooms, hotels, and reservations. So we just want the hotels. So this is the DB set. And what we want to do in this case is actually we want to list everything, to list async that we have in this hotels table. So get all. And of course, for this one, for this toList async, because it's an async version of toList, because it gets executed on the database, we need Entity Framework Core. So right now we see if we hover the mouse over this variable, we see that it's type list of hotel. So it's actually exactly what we need. So in this OK, we can just return hotels. So that would be it. Okay, we are cool with that. Now let's go here in this create by ID. Once again, we have to transform that in an async method. So we have task async task of iAction result and get by ID. And here what we will do is var hotel in this case equals, on the context, once again we have this property hotels, and here we can simply use first, or of course I also have to type it correctly, so first or default async. Once again async because it gets executed on the database, but in this one we can use a lambda expression to specify a condition about what hotel exactly do we want to retrieve. And in our case, we want to retrieve a hotel with a certain ID that we actually get from the routing. So we can say here age from hotel. So we want to get the first hotel that has the hotel ID equal to the ID that we actually get from our routing. And for instance, here we can return then the hotel itself. So that would be okay. Now, the next thing here is that we need to create a hotel. So we'll have this HTTP post. Now, the cool thing is that we get the hotel directly from the body. That's things that are really done by ASP.NET Core. So we'll see even when we execute this on Swagger how this exactly works. But it's really not complicated. The idea is when you post something, you would have to provide a JSON body. Now, what this does is that ASP.NET Core will look at the JSON body, so at the properties and the values, and will try to match them to the properties and the values for the hotel. So it would have an ID, a name, stars, address, city, and so on. Now, of course, this does ASP.NET Core by default, so we really don't have to care about that. But we'll also have different ways to also define a little bit more granularly what exactly our clients should send. But that would be a topic probably that we'll cover in 2 lessons from now. So the idea is that once the request gets to our controller, we will already have this hotel here because it will be placed there by ASP.NET Core. So taken from the body of the request and placed as an incoming parameter to my controller action. So what this actually means is that we don't have here to do anything except to say on the context hotels, and here we have this method add. And this is how we actually add a hotel. But the very important stuff here to remember is when we say here the context hotels add, what it does, it actually adds the hotel to the DB set itself. So everything is happening in code. So when you call this add method, it actually just adds that to the DB set. So it's still everything happening in memory. It's no transaction, no call to the database. Now, in order to actually make a call to the database and say, okay, now please save the changes, that's very easy. We have this await context, or CTX in our case, and we have this method save changes async. And please remember, this is once again a very important topic. If you go to interviews, everybody will ask you about that. Believe me. So the thing is, when you use this add method, there is no call to the database. Everything is happening in memory. The call to the database happens only when you call this save changes async. Until you do that, no call to the database is made. And the reason why we would like to do that is that usually or very often we might need, or we might, for instance, want to add different type of things here. Once again, this is just an example, but for instance, we say that whenever we add a new hotel, maybe we want to also add a room or something like that. So we would then just have here context.rooms.add, and we'll just here create a new room with the default constructor, and that's it. Now, the idea is that we add something to the context in this step, we add something to the context in this step. Now, when we call the save changes async, everything that was changed on the DB context will be saved to the database. And I guess you can already see why we actually want to do that, because we don't want to make a call to the database any time that we add something. We just want to do our stuff that we need to do in our code. And when we are ready, only then just say to the context, save everything that needs to be saved. And that's what happens when this save changes async method gets called. So once again, this is very, very important when you're using or when you're working with Entity Framework Core. When you add or update or remove from a DB set, this happens only in code. So in memory, no call to the database is made. The call to the database is only made when we call this save changes method. Okay. And now, usually what we return here is a 201 created. So we can return here. Let's move this in created at action. And what this method actually does, this return type, it actually returns a 201 created, but we have to specify some information. So first of all, we have to specify the name of the action that would actually retrieve this resource. And the name of the action would be this get hotel by ID. So we can just use this name of, if I'm also typing correctly, get hotel by ID. Then the next thing is we will have to specify an anonymous object for the routing params, because here we need the ID as a routing param. So we just would have here new object, and we have this ID, and that would be equal to hotel ID. And then last but not least, the third thing that we provide is the entire hotel object that was created, and that will be placed on the body. So this is actually what happens here. And of course, this is also async, so it should return a task of iActionResult, just like all the other methods. And now everything should be good to go here for this create hotel. And we have just two more things here to do, but those are easy. So probably the most complex one here was the create, because we have this concept of adding things and then save changes async, which is very, very important on Entity Framework Core. Cool. So right now we have this update hotel. Let me just grab a short drink. In the meantime, please, if you have any questions, if you have anything that you would like to say, please just feel free to use the chat. It would be highly, highly appreciated. And if you in any way want to support this chat, these lessons and the work that I'm doing generally for this Code Wrinkles channel, you have this super chat option where you can actually make a donation of your choice using a super chat or a super sticker. So that would also be highly appreciated. It's not that I will quit doing this series if you don't. So it's really no pressure to do that. But of course, if you just want to support that, that would be awesome. Okay, so let's go back here to this update. So when we update something, there's actually two steps here. So the first step here is that, okay, we need to actually get the hotel from the database that we want to update. And then we actually have to check and update each of the properties from the hotel that we get in the body should be updated on the hotel that we got from the database, because this should presumably be the hotel object with the updated properties that we want to actually save in the database. So once again, here we'll have then for the first step var hotel equals await context, and of course this should be also async task of iActionResult, just like we also had previously. So that would be cool. So we have this context dot hotels, and here first or default async. And just like we did in the get by ID method for the hotels, we are just looking for a hotel with a hotel ID that's equal to what we get actually from the routing. And when we got this hotel, we just map these properties from the updated hotel to our current hotel. And right now we'll do this manually, but in the next lessons, we'll also see exactly how or which tools we can actually use to make these kind of things more or less automatically. So we'll look into that. So right now we can just say here hotel. We should maybe just focus on three properties. Maybe we want to update the stars. So it will be updated.stars. That's cool. With that hotel. What else can we update? Well, we can update the description. Cool. Now, presumably, we won't update the city or the address, because the hotel cannot simply just move from one city or one country to the other. So city, country, and address. So not something, but name. Maybe somebody wants to do a rebranding and updates the name, or wants to update the name. So okay, we have done that. We have mapped all the updates that we actually want, and then the next step is, of course, we need to tell to the DB context in one way or the other that, hey, we have some updates on this hotel instance. So we can say here, for instance, context.hotels.update. And once again, what we have said to the add method, it also corresponds to the update method. So we just update the hotel, but right now no call to the database is made. So when we are ready with everything and we want to really make a call to the database and do the updates, we have to use this context.saveChangesAsync method, and then those changes should be saved and we return no content. I see there's another question here after save async. The return line I didn't understand. ID of hotel is needed. I'm not sure exactly at which one do you mean? You mean for this one with created action? It's only that this created action, it returns an HTTP 201. And I guess maybe it will make more sense once we will run the application and once we'll actually use Swagger to create a new hotel. And probably, I'm pretty sure that it will make more sense then, because we will be able to see exactly what the response is, and we will then be able to map the response to actually what we have done here. So we will go back to that. And then the last thing that we need to return here or to do is a delete. So when we want to delete a hotel from our database, and for that one we have this hotel ID okay, good. Okay, so in this delete, that's actually fairly easy. It's similarly to the update, only that we just remove things. So we need var hotel equals of course we need to make this async and task of iAction result. This is how asynchronicity works in .NET. And we have here await context.hotels. Okay, first or default async. And just like previously, we need a hotel for which the hotel ID equals to the ID that we get from the route. And once we get this hotel, we can simply say context.hotels.remove. And just remove the hotel. Once again, just like with update and add, this one doesn't make a call to the database. So it just removes it from the memory collection. So it doesn't do anything with the database. When we have everything ready and we want to persist everything to the database, we just call await context save changes async. Cool. Okay, and then we return no content. So if it was successful, we just say that it's successful, but we don't have anything to return here, which is usually what we should return according to REST principles mostly. Cool. So right now we have a full CRUD controller with database support. So let's actually run this application, and I will be very curious if we don't have any errors, because usually no matter how simple the application is that you're building, you will always have some errors. So, but yeah, we will see that. Cool. Let's so this should be our application. So the first sign is that Swagger loaded correctly. So that's a first good sign that things are working. Of course, right now we don't have anything in the database. So let's start by actually creating a hotel using this post. And here we have this try it out. And here we see that we have different type of stuff that we will have to provide. And once again, we'll talk about exactly how we can actually customize what exactly a client should provide. But what we don't want to provide here, we don't want to provide an ID, and we don't want to actually provide a list of rooms. So we can just skip that, and we'll talk about how we will add rooms when we'll talk about nested resources. and here this hotel ID. But why is this problematic? So probably I have deleted something that I shouldn't have deleted. So let's click on try it out again. But it's kind of like, okay, just gives an error. You know, let me just do a refresh for that. And let's be a little bit more careful in this case. So we have these rooms, but you know, we just, so it should be actually, but I guess it just has these errors anyway, so I'm not sure exactly why. Okay, but let's not waste time on Swagger stuff. Let me just remove. So the rooms is not something that I want to provide here. And the name, let's call this Hotel 1. Let's give it, I don't know, maybe a 3-star. Address, address, I don't know, city, city, country, country, and description. Hotel description, and that's actually what we want. Let me just put a breakpoint here on the create hotel. I see here, okay, what's the async method? Oh, we don't have an await here. That's bad. I don't think I can do really this change and everything would still work. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. So yeah, but I went here because I wanted to put a breakpoint in this create hotel because I want to just look what we actually get. And in fact, we will actually don't get this this type of stuff here. You know what? Let me just copy this. And let me close the application and start from scratch because we have made this change here while the application was running. And let's start the application from scratch. Shouldn't take too long. Okay. So Swagger is opening. Everything should be fine, I guess. Let's go here once again to the post. But this time it should be easier because we can just delete everything and paste what we already have. And let's execute it. So while we execute it, we see that we hit the breakpoint. So the correct controller action was picked out. And if we look at this hotel, we see that we have this information. Some address, some city, some country, some description. Now for hotel ID, we haven't provided anything, so it's 0. For name, we have this one. For rooms, it's null because we have deleted it. And for stars, we have 3, which is fairly cool. Now, what we do here is, once again, we add this hotel to our DB set. And right now, when we use save changes async, that would be saved to the database. And probably we got an error. So that was actually bad. Okay, no, I don't see an error, but I also don't see a response. Okay, the response was 200. Okay, but why was the response 200? That's strange. Okay, because we have this. You know, you see that the strange things happened right now, and I really don't get what happens. What happened when we clicked on save changes. So let's do another thing. Let's go back to Swagger. Let's see if we have created something in a database, so we can go and try it out and execute this get all, and it still returns 200 and with nothing here, which is still strange. Okay, I guess. Let me just look, because I'm not sure exactly what we have done the previous lesson in our middleware here. So, but here we just added a header to this one, so it shouldn't be a problem with that. Let's also take a look to the database that we have here. So it's view SQL Server Object Explorer hotels, and in hotels we can go on view data. And we see that we don't have the hotel. So the hotel was definitely not written in the database. Okay, so let's go back to the controller and let's try to understand what exactly happened here. Because we have this public async task of iAction result. and then we add this, we await and save the changes, and then we actually want to return this created at action. But this kind of like, okay, we have an error. Cannot access a disposed context instance. For this error, disposing context instance, object name, data context. Okay, so that's kind of strange message because we have added the entity framework core data context just like we needed to do. So let me check once again. So we have this data context here that we defined as a private read-only field. We have this context here. So everything should be fine. So this should not be null, and it should also not be disposed at all. So everything is also async. And here we just have this one. So okay, guys, if you look here, and because probably there's some typo or something that I really miss, and that's really simple, because that's actually everything that we theoretically should have. Let's just look also in the startup. So we have the services add DB context. And then theoretically this adds the DB context as a scoped service. So the service should live as long as the request lives. So as long as we are inside the controller action method, the DB context should actually be there. Okay, so let's go back here and well, this save changes async, and then we just return this. Okay, and we just add. That's kind of like strange. Let me just run again and try to maybe look a little bit deeper into what actually this context is once we actually add the hotel to it, because that might be important. So yeah, Swagger API opened, and yeah, let's just post a new hotel. Let's try it out. We already have something that is actually copy pasted here. So execute. We are here, so we have this context, and we said on this context we have information about the databases and things like that, but also we have our properties, so our DB sets like hotels. And right now this one actually contains 0 elements because we haven't loaded anything from the database and we haven't added anything here. So let's just go one step further, and we see that now it was added to. Right now, if we go to hotels, and if we go to this local, count is 1, which is correct. And then we await save changes. And kind of like something strange happens when we want to save changes. So that's the debug. Let's look into, but we still don't have an error yet. So I'm really curious about what really happens here. An error occurred using connection to the database, okay, on the server. So yeah, something is problematic with the connection string, but I'm not sure exactly what, because it's exactly the same connection string that we actually used when we performed the migration. So I'm not sure about that. Let's just look into it once again. Did we maybe do a small change here? So we have this initial catalog, which is CWK booking, integrated security, timeout, encrypted. Okay. Okay, so that's actually the connection string, the way that we actually have it. You know, let us just remove some of these things from the connection string, because I'm not sure if one of them might create here problems. Connection timeout. So actually, theoretically, everything that we need for a connection string is that one. So yeah, let's just try to run that again. So it somehow fails when it tries to connect with the database, but it worked when we performed the migrations and when we updated the database. That's really weird stuff happening here. So let's try it out again. and check out what happens here. So once again, we have these hotels, we add this, and then when we save the changes, once again, we had an error here. Okay, so somehow the connection to the database is not working properly, and I'm really not sure exactly why. That should totally be working fine as long as we were even able to perform the migrations that we have already created, because we have the tables, we have everything. We have added here this SQL Server. And by the way, if this would kind of like be wrong, then also running the migrations or updating the database, that would also actually fail, because it also connects to the same database, actually the same way that it should be. And then this get connection string. So let's just put a breakpoint here to just take a look about what we have in this connection string variable. But it could be that we also have some setting on my database, in my Visual Studio database, that kind of like restricts me to actually do that. We have this connection string. Let's click on view. So it's data source, that's correct. Then we have the initial catalog, which is the CWK booking, and we have integrated security true. So yeah, the connection string should actually be just fine. So there shouldn't be any problem with the connection string at all. Okay, guys. So I guess probably here I really can't explain what happens. That's a really weird message, because we have everything in place that we actually need. So I'm not sure exactly why this happens. So we have the context is still here, everything's all right. But in the local, we see that we have count 1 because we have added 1. But still, when we want to save the changes, we get a weird error that it is not able to connect to the database. So yeah, once again, we got the same error here. Okay, so I guess we will call it a day for today. I will look into what exactly the problem is here. Maybe there is some misconfiguration with the database, but if you follow this along, I'm 99% sure that in your case it will work. So it probably has something to do with the database that I might already have used and settings that I have. But I'm sure that if you follow along and do this exactly the way that I did here, it should work. And by next Monday, I will also fix my database and tell you exactly how I did this. And we'll make sure that that our controllers work, and then we'll move on and talk about repositories and services. Okay, so then that's actually it for today. I guess this session was a little bit longer, but I think it was a very productive one, and we covered a lot of ground because we have started from the packages that we actually need to install when we want to use Entity Framework Core in our application. We have then discussed this whole idea of connection strings and the app settings to JSON file. We have then seen how we can add the data context, the DB context, to our application. And of course, we have talked a lot about what a DB context is in Entity Framework Core. We have performed a migration, we have updated the database, so we were able to also see that right now our database contains the tables that we need. However, unfortunately, while we try to use this connection string in our controller, it kind of like fails that it cannot connect. So I will have to look into it, but I'm fairly sure that if you code along with me with your own database, it should work just fine. So yeah, this being said, thank you very, very much for watching, and please tune in the next Monday for the next lesson in this one, and subscribe to this channel if you didn't do already. Hit the notification bell to just be notified whenever we do something, because probably tomorrow we'll do another live stream also with an API, but in that one we just use some more advanced topics about what actually an API is and how you would create that. So it's more targeted to mid-level and advanced topics, I would say. So if you want to just also take a look at that, then please feel free to just tune in tomorrow, most probably. Thank you very much once again for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best. Take care and see you soon.